Welcome to the 2021 Volume 3, Issue 1, Summer Podcast Edition, Part 1, of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, published June 15, 2025. All contents are protected under the Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives, 4.0 International Deed. For figures, citations, notes, and references, please refer to the printed articles at www.jpe.online.org. Part 1. Table of Contents. Brady, Michael. 2021. Précis Emotion, The Basics. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, Number 1, 1-4. https://doi.org/10-33497/2021 Summered 1. Benzayev Aaron. 2021. Emotions, Theories and Moral Value. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, Number 1, 5-9. https://doi.org/10-33497/2021 Summer.2. Starkey, Charles. 2021. Perceptual Emotions and Emotional Virtue. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, Number 1, 10-15. https://doi.org/10-33497/2021 Summer.3. Reyes Cardenas, Paniel. 2020. Bringing Emotions to Reason. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, Number 1, 16-23. https://doi.org/10-33497/2021 Summer.4. Bloomfield, Paul. 2021. Beyond the Basics of Emotions. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, Number 1, 24-30. https://doi.org/10-33497/2021 Summer.5.
Article 1. Précis Emotion, The Basics, by Michael Brady. Emotion, The Basics is an introductory text about the nature and value of emotion and highlights the very many ways in it was an enjoyable and rather challenging task to write an introductory text on a topic as large as the emotions. In one sense, the challenges are due to the fact that emotions are studied in a variety of disciplines, with philosophy coming to the academic table somewhat late in the day. Psychologists, neuroscientists, and historians have all studied emotions in detail, and the literature on emotions in these areas, psychology in particular, is significant indeed. There are different approaches to the nature of emotions, ranging from those who judge emotions to be more or less adaptations from a set of biologically basic types, to those who think that emotions are more or less socially constructed. There are those who are interested in more theoretical questions about the nature of emotions, with some focusing on the question of whether we can define what an emotion is, whereas others are much more concerned about practical questions about what emotions enable us to do. Even within a subject, let's focus on philosophy here, there are divergent research interests. Some wish to study emotions because they are interested in broadly moral or ethical questions, for instance, those having to do with the relation between emotion and virtue, or the role of emotion in moral judgment and motivation. Some are interested in the role that emotions play in aesthetics, while others focus more on the contribution that emotions make to action and decision-making, and others still on the role and value of emotions for our epistemic activities. In another sense, writing the book was tricky because of the need to speak to different audiences. In the main, the book is intended as an introductory text for those who are studying emotions and related topics at a college or university, or who have an academic interest in some of the central topics that engage philosophers, and those who are working in some other disciplines. However, the book is also aimed at a general reader, someone who is interested and curious about emotion, and who has an intrinsic interest or curiosity in finding out about the subject for its own sake, but who is not engaged in academic or other forms of study. As a result, the book needed to be written to be of sufficient interest to different cohorts of readers, albeit ones united in the desire to find out more about a central element of human life and experience. As I discovered, it is also a tricky balancing act between writing something accessible and informative for someone without much of a philosophy background, whilst at the same time having enough philosophical content to be of use to philosophy students and to those with research interest in the emotions. As it turned out, I focused somewhat more on the first two categories of readers than the last category, a sensible decision, given the aim of the basic series and word limits, but one which, as we'll see in the following commentaries, left some of the more philosophical issues and questions underexplained and underdiscussed. Likewise, and as the commentators point out, there is too little said here about the history of emotion, and not much about socially constructed emotions, and what there is about psychological theories of emotion is unfortunately brief and sketchy. I hope, therefore, that my responses to the commentaries go some way towards acknowledging things that I should have said, both in terms of areas where I got things wrong and places where more clarity and detail was required. Let me now turn to the general structure of the book and the ideas therein. As we'll also see, I paint a rather positive, perhaps too positive, picture of the emotions, of what they are, and of what they can do for us. In part, this was also due to structural constraints. It is good to have a central organizing theme running through any book, and I took for mine the overarching idea that emotions can be extremely valuable for us in a number of ways, which I then explain. It is not surprising, given this theme, that the positive contribution that emotions make is emphasized rather more than their genuine, well-known, and deleterious effects on ourselves and our society. Another guiding thought will be a familiar one. Emotions can have significant value insofar as they are outside of and run counter to rational thinking and deliberation. In a clash between reason and emotion, therefore, we might do better by being moved by the latter instead of the former. Once again, I'm under no illusions about the many ways in which our emotions can have a negative impact on our flourishing and our successful pursuit of our goals. So it is no part of my remit that we should always follow our heart rather than our head. That would be a recipe for disaster. But what I hope that the book achieves in this area is to strengthen the case for a more careful and judicious consideration by researchers and readers alike of those situations where emotions, rather than reason, should hold sway. As I suggest, this might happen more often than common sense thinking about the relation between these two faculties proposes. The content of the book's 5 chapters is as follows. In Chapter 1, I outline at a very general level of the kind of thing emotion is and survey some of the main theories about emotion. I focus on feeling, cognitive, and perceptual theories, although we'll see later that this division and the terminology might be suspect. We start with a basic model of emotion as a phenomenon which involves various elements or components, which are all present in paradigmatic cases of emotion. I then explain how each theory prioritizes one particular component. The feeling theory focuses on bodily feelings, the cognitive theory on judgments or beliefs, the perceptual model on perceptual experiences of value, and suggests that each is correct with respect to a limited range of emotion. No one theory is plausible as an explanation of all of the things we regard as emotions. In other words, this pluralist picture goes some way to explaining the plausibility of each theory for its supporters, who tend to focus on the kinds or types of emotion that best support their own theoretical cases, and also the persistent disagreement between theories generated by the attempt to cover all other types. In the chapters that follow, I explain how the different components that are present in paradigmatic cases of emotion work in enabling us to live good and happy lives. Chapter 2 examines the epistemic value of emotion, how emotion can help us in our believing, knowing, and understanding. I look in some detail at the emotion of curiosity as an exemplar of an emotion with particular epistemic value, moving us to seek out and amass potentially valuable information at relatively little cognitive cost. I then focus on the role that emotional attention plays in helping us to gain vital information about and evaluative understanding of ourselves and our world. Chapter 3 focuses on the important roles that emotion plays when it comes to decision-making and action. Here I argue against the idea that decision-making is, ideally, a practice that is as free from emotion as possible. Such a view is, or at least was, standard fare in traditional thinking about how rational people make choices. But the model is seriously flawed, as a number of theorists have pointed out. Instead, I explain, following Antonio Damasio, how decision-making is imbued with emotion, so much so that effective decisions would be nigh on impossible without it. I then look at how emotion is vital for motivating us effectively, in a way that moves beyond the standard belief-desire model of motivation. That model might be true in a range of non-emotional cases, but it is a mistaken picture of emotional motivation, precisely because it leaves out how emotional feelings play a central and vital role when emotions move us. I illustrate the motivational importance of feelings by looking at the emotion of remorse. Chapter 4 turns away from the individual to focus on the social. Here I show how emotions are of great value for promoting and maintaining a variety of social goods. Cooperative behavior, personal relationships, and social and political movements. I consider how emotions can have social value because they help to maintain and strengthen interpersonal relationships. Following Robert Frank, I explain how emotions such as love can be vital for solving certain commitment problems. I then consider how emotions such as pride can communicate to others one's valuable qualities, thereby facilitating productive cooperative activity. And I close by looking at how group emotions, such as feelings of indignation and solidarity, can have significant social value in motivating political change and other social goods. In the concluding chapter, CH5, I show how emotions are centrally involved in the distinctively human activities surrounding morality and art. I explain why, in the absence of emotion, we wouldn't develop morally and could not be virtuous. Equally, without emotion, we would fail to engage with and understand works of art, literature, and music. I close by suggesting that something similar is true for scientific endeavor and religious practice. If so, the case can be made that emotion is at the heart of those distinctive practices that make us human. Article 2. Emotions, Theories, and Moral Value by Aaron Ben-Zayev. Introductory books are not easy to write. One must summarize in a fair manner other people's views while presenting one's own, which is often contrary to the views of those others. Michael Brady, 2019, does a good job of both explaining his own views and those of whom he opposes. His discussion is well written, deep, and balanced. This excellent book offers a clearly articulated and convincing perspective on basic disputes in the philosophy of emotions. Although it deals with complex issues, it presents them in an engaging manner. I agree with most of Brady's main claims. That emotions are extremely important for human beings. Emotions are valuable in many cases where they run counter to rational thinking. Without emotions, we would not develop morally and could not be virtuous. And that without emotions, we would fail to engage with works of art, literature, and music. Brady rightly claims, contrary to a prevailing view, that emotions are of great importance to our truth-seeking activities. Moreover, without emotions, a whole realm of value would be lost or inaccessible to us. I will not discuss the many issues concerning Brady's view, which I fully embrace, but rather focus on two major issues: emotional components and theories, and the role of emotions in morality. I argue that Brady's classification of emotional components and emotional theories are problematic. I also basically agree with Brady's view on the role of emotions in morality, but following Spinoza, I further developed this view. Emotional components and theories. Brady identifies 6 components or elements that make up emotions. 1. Perception. 2. Evaluation. 3. A bodily change and expression. 4. A feeling. 5. Motivation to act. And 6. Thinking and attending. Based on these identifications, he distinguishes between 3 major types of theories of emotions. A. Feeling theories. B. Cognitive theories. And C. Perceptual theories. Although Brady seems to follow a common formulation, I believe that both distinctions, as well as the connection between them, are problematic. To begin with, it is unclear what the criteria are for being included on each list and whether these criteria overlap. Thus, concerning the first list, perception and thinking, as well as memory and imagination, involve evaluation. Bodily, including cerebral, changes are on a different level of description and exist in all mental phenomena. The absence of memory and imagination, which are essential in emotional experiences, is obvious in the first list. And if these are the six major components, why do we not have six related major types of theories? For example, why are motivational action readiness, e.g., Frigida 2007, and thinking theories, e.g., Nussbaum 2001, missing from Brady's list of major theories? Brady also speaks about two temporal aspects of evaluation, that is, present and future, suggesting that evaluation may be part of the after-the-fact perspective rather than in the experience itself. What about the past dimension? The structure of the list of theories is also hard to understand. Perception is commonly regarded in philosophy and psychology as a major cognitive capacity, but it is not part of the cognitive theories. Brady rightly criticizes extreme versions of the three theories he proposes, i.e., feeling, cognitive, and perceptual, suggesting that each of them is valid for only a specific group of emotions. He is aware of the explanatory limitation of his proposal, but believes that this is the best way to cope with the vast complexity associated with emotions. The status of the evaluative component in emotions is complex. Brady includes evaluation, but not cognition, in the list of emotional components, and includes cognitive, but not evaluative, theories in the list of major emotional theories. This may suggest a problematic understanding of these concepts. An extreme evaluative theory is one that assumes an actual judgmental process preceding the experience. A subtler approach claims that emotional experiences have an inherent evaluative tone, without assuming actual judgments as the cause of this experience. As an alternative, I would suggest that all mental modes of reference, cognition, evaluation, motivation, and feeling exist in all emotions, though various emotions may differ with respect to the intensity and nature of these modes, as well as in the associated mental capacities, namely perception, memory, imagination, and thinking. Such a view maintains both the aspect of generality and the distinctive features of each emotion. To offer just one example of a different, apparently more consistent classification, I have suggested distinguishing between mental capacities, such as perception, memory, imagination, and thought, and mental modes of reference, such as cognition, evaluation, motivation, and feeling. I have proposed to include in the basic emotional components four modes of reference, namely cognition, evaluation, motivation, and feeling, Benziev, 2000, 2017. The cognitive component consists, in its narrow sense, of information about the given circumstances. The evaluative component involves assessment of the personal significance of this information. The motivational component addresses our desires or readiness to act in the given circumstances, and the feeling component is a kind of consciousness associated with our own state. The various mental capacities are also included in actual emotional experiences. In light of the various components, we can speak about cognitive theories, such as perceptual, e.g., Reed Taplett, 2016. Reed also Day, 1994. Evaluative theories, appraisal theories, e.g., Reed Nussbaum, 2001. Motivational theories, such as action readiness, e.g., Frigida, 2007. And feeling theories, such as James Lang theory, Red e.g., Canon 1927. The cognitive, evaluative, and motivational are often included within the cognitivist evaluative approach, whose main opponent is the feeling approach. The role of emotions in morality. Brady is right in emphasizing the role of emotions in everyday life, even if in some cases, mainly those of emotional excess, this is a negative impact. Hence, he opposes the prevailing claim that since rational thinking is what distinguishes humans from animals, we should always prefer in our decision-making processes thinking over emotions. Brady shows the value of emotions in various realms. For example, people take us and our promises more seriously if an emotion is part of our attitude. The role of emotions is particularly interesting in the fields of morality and art. Contrary to Kant, Brady argues that emotions are extremely important in our moral behavior. The presence of love, for example, significantly enhances our trust in others. Brady further argues that emotions are clearly not sufficient for promoting our well-being, but they are necessary for this well-being. Emotions are essential for being a good person. In this regard, Brady takes, and rightly so in my opinion, an Aristotelian, rather than Kantian, position concerning the connection between morality and emotions. Aristotle introduces a distinction between the continent or self-controlled type of person and the one who is fully virtuous. The continent person, knowing what she should do, does it contrary to her emotional tendencies and desires. The fully virtuous person, knowing what she should do, does it in accordance with such tendencies and desires. In Aristotle's view, the fully virtuous person is morally superior to the merely self-controlled one. For Aristotle, a virtuous person is one who not only acts virtuously, but also has the appropriate emotional dispositions and effective traits while doing so. Kant seems to draw the same distinction as Aristotle, but weights it the other way. The self-controlled agent is considered to be morally superior, for she acts without any emotional inclination, but for the sake of duty alone. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, I-13. Kant, 1785, I. Also read Hursthouse, 1999. This characterization of virtuous people makes them experts of morality in the sense that they know, in a spontaneous and intuitive manner, what is good and bad. Is such knowledge merely emotional? I do not think so. I agree with Brady's claim that an essential moral difference between virtuous people and ordinary people is their sensitivity. Virtuous people are less sensitive to immoral temptations and are more sensitive to moral wrongdoing. Following Spinoza's lead, we can discuss three major cognitive systems: emotional intuition, deliberative thinking, and intuitive reasoning. Spinoza, 1677. IP40S1, 2. IP47, V5P33. Although deliberative thinking generally has more cognitive value than emotional intuition, there is yet another intuitive system, which can be termed intuitive reasoning, the value of which is generally higher than that of the deliberative system. Taken together, the first two systems yield the third system, that of intuitive reasoning. In this sense, emotions play an essential, but not exclusive, role in knowledge, and sometimes not the crucial one. I believe that this accords well with Brady's view on emotions. Conclusion. My differences with Brady on various aspects of the nature of emotions hardly affect my admiration of his insightful discussions, which include such interesting topics as emotion and understanding, emotion and action, emotions and social groups, and emotion, morality, and art. I highly recommend the book. Article 3. Perceptual Emotions and Emotional Virtue by Charles Starkey. Michael Brady's book Emotion, The Basics, 2019, is a work that surveys a number of issues within philosophical emotion theory and critically assesses traditions and strains of literature in each of these areas. The book does an admirable job of describing each topic in a way that is accessible to non-specialists, but also provides illuminating analyses and criticisms that stimulate the thoughts of specialists in the philosophy of emotion and that bring into the discussion a variety of sources and traditions. This paper will focus on two areas: perceptual models of emotion and the relation between emotion and virtue, binding and perceptual models of emotion. In Chapter 1, Brady considers various kinds of theories of emotion, including feeling, cognitive, and perceptual theories. Perceptual theories liken emotions to perceptual states. Brady distinguishes between literal and non-literal versions of perceptual theory. Literal versions hold that emotional experience is a form of perceptual experience of value. Non-literal versions hold that emotions are not literally sense perceptions, but are something like evaluative construals. Brady, 2019, pages 29 to 30. Brady raises two concerns about perceptual theories. One is that they arguably collapse into feeling or cognitive theories of emotion, and the other that the analogy between emotion and perception is questionable at best, and is thus not an adequate way of characterizing emotion. Brady, 2019, pages 30 to 32. These appear to be serious problems for perceptual theories of emotion, but I believe that a close look at the nuts and bolts of perception and emotional experience reveals a structure of emotion that avoids these problems. In what follows, I'll provide a sketch of a perceptual theory of emotion that avoids these problems. On this model, emotions are distinct, unified psychological states that incorporate cognitive and affective elements, but are akin to states described by perceptual theories of emotion. Unlike so-called hybrid theories of emotion that include cognition and affective states, Lyons 1980, it provides an explanation of their relation through the concept of psychological binding, emotional elements, and phenomenal binding. An alternative that can resolve the problems of these approaches is the idea that emotions consist of a particular association of affective arousal, cognition, and relational theme information that are bound together in an emotional state. Emotions are characterized by affective arousal, namely coordinated physiological changes, which can include changes in skin conductance, heart rate, facial expression, visceral responses, and feelings of the experience of these changes. Ekman 1977, Prinz 2004. Paradigm emotions involve cognitive recognition of objects, including physical objects, events, and states of affairs, at which the emotion is directed. The object of the emotion, Nussbaum 2001, Solomon 1993. Relational theme information is the product of the activation of a psychological mechanism that is attuned to detecting relations to the environment that bear upon fundamental concerns and which trigger emotional responses when such relations are present. Such basic types of concerns have been categorized by Richard Lazarus as core relational themes. For example, Lazarus identifies a demeaning offense against me and mine as the core relational theme of the emotion anger. It is such a relation between self and environment that constitutes the most general content of anger. Lazarus 1991, pages 122. In instances of emotion, affective arousal and cognitions are co-present, but they are clearly linked in a unique way, as only specific cognitions are associated with physiological changes and vice versa. We may hear other sounds and see other things when afraid of a dog, but it is the dog and only the dog that is the object of the emotion, and that is linked to the physiological changes. We do not associate the changes with a visual percept of a person who is walking behind the dog or with an auditory percept of a car horn that sounds. In addition, we associate the affective arousal and the cognition with information about our relation to our natural or social environment, i.e., a core relational theme. The cognition of the dog is not merely associated with the arousal, as the event is experienced as a dangerous event, not merely as an arousing event. The core relational theme of threat is associated with the cognition. Perceptual binding occurs because various types of perceptual information are processed independently in separate regions of the brain, and binding is necessary for the information to be unified into a coherent representation of the object. Binding is necessary for visual information coming from different streams to be unified, such as the unified perceptual representation of colors and shapes. Cross-modal binding is necessary to associate the visual percept of a bell ringing with the sound, auditory percept, of the bell. Binding mechanisms have been routinely discussed in the literature on the binding problem in psychology and cognitive science. Treisman 1999, and there are competing explanations of their nature, but regardless of this, binding is a central feature of perception. For reasons given above, it seems clear that in addition to perceptual binding, there's a type of binding consisting of the psychological binding of affective arousal with specific cognitions and with relational theme information. This is emotional binding, and it is akin to the psychological binding that occurs in perception. And, as in the case of perceptual binding, there's an experiential unity which suggests that the brain binds together information in a coherent way. Binding and concerns about perceptual theories. This binding model of emotion resolves the two concerns regarding perceptual theories of emotion. The first is, once again, that the literal version of such a view collapses into a feeling or cognitive theory of emotion. In response, this binding model is both more elaborate and distinct from a feeling theory, as the informationally robust cognition of an emotional object is part of a normal emotional event, even if the elicitor of the emotion is a product of robust cognitive perception. Conversely, this model does not collapse into a cognitive theory of emotion because the affective element of emotion is an integral part of the perception, as it is bound up with the cognition of the object of the emotion. One might claim that such a perception is nevertheless a cognitive event, but such a claim arguably broadens cognition to the degree that it refers to any robust perception. And such a broad conception both obscures what is distinct about emotional states and overlooks important differences between this account and other cognitive theories of emotion in the traditional judgmentalist camp. There is evidence that emotional states differ from similar unemotional states in various ways related to perception, which will be discussed shortly. And for this reason, emotional states are importantly different from non-emotional cognitive states. And it is reasonable to believe that such differences are related to the unique binding involved in such states. The second concern about perceptual theories is that the analogy between emotional and perceptual experience is questionable. This is principally because emotions themselves provide far from sufficient reason to believe what they represent, such as a feeling of untrustworthiness, and because emotions can be considered irrational in a way that perceptions are not. Brady identifies some important differences between emotion and perception, and I want to suggest that the difference is scalar rather than categorical. First, there are reasons to believe that emotions may be more flexible perceptual responses, and thus more prone to error than other kinds of perception. The psychologist Phoebe Ellsworth, 2007, has noted that just as we are well served by having fairly rigid perceptual systems for constructing representations from our various sense modalities, we are also served by having emotional responses that are not rigidly coupled with and only with particular perceptual stimuli. For this reason, emotions are not domain-specific modules, but general evaluations that can be activated in a wide variety of contexts. Relational theme information can be paired with a wide variety of objects in our physical and social environments. Insofar as they are perceptions of value, it makes sense that they are not tied to a narrow set of stimuli. And because emotions are looser and capable of some cognitive penetration/modification, we rightfully hold them to be more appropriate items of rational assessment. In addition, there is another rather different way of explaining our assessment of emotions as rational or irrational. Rational assessment can be seen as part of our practices. It is important to hold people accountable for their emotions for practical reasons. Loosely following Strawson's argument regarding reactive attitudes, Strawson 1974. Such assessments can enter into a causal nexus and, at least in some cases, change our reactions and behavior. The more plastic the emotional response and more related to social thriving and social good, the more likely we are to assess its rationality. For instance, I would speculate that people would be more reluctant to regard fear experience on a roller coaster as irrational than shame at one's accent, because the former is less plastic and, presuming the roller coaster is appropriately safe, less relevant to social or personal good. Thus, the difference between rational assessment of perceptions and emotions is based primarily on practical rather than ontological differences between the two. For these reasons, I believe that the binding model of emotion avoids the reservations about the perceptual analogy for emotions. Emotion and virtue. I'll now turn to Brady's discussion of emotion and virtue. He argues that without the right kinds of emotions, virtue would not be possible. Reasons provided in support of this include that emotions serve as a more effective motivating force than belief or desire alone. In addition, some emotions are particularly effective in gaining knowledge and understanding regarding situations involving values, since emotions consume our attention and, again, motivate us to look for reasons. These arguments are persuasive. Here I'll explore some other ways in which emotions can be operative in virtue outside of their relation to motivation. The patterns of emotional response that we have, including both the episodes in which emotions occur and the types of emotions that occur, can affect virtue-relevant traits because they affect the way in which we see and take in information about the world and the gravity that such perceptions have for us, both of which are prerequisites for decision-making and action in the world. In addition, emotions are critical to virtue because they maintain the level of importance that values have for us. and in doing so forestall axiological entropy, namely the fading of the importance that values have for us, and thus the virtues that are dependent on those values. Emotion and perception. There are reasons to believe that emotions affect virtue traits because of the effects that emotions have on perception in a way that is distinct from the motivational role in gathering information and seeking reasons. Emotions can affect the breadth or narrowness of our attention. Long-standing psychological work on negative emotions and attention indicates that the field of awareness is narrowed or funneled when there is emotional arousal. Easterbrook, 1959. Thus, being negatively emotionally aroused by a situation will make someone more likely to notice the situation. In addition, there has been a growing consensus that positive emotions broaden the scope of attention, Fredrickson 1998, which can also affect what one comes to notice. There is also evidence that emotions affect both what we see in the sense of whether we see an object and the nature of the appearance of an object, Balcetis and Dunning 2006. Relatedly, additional processing of information after an initial emotional response towards an object that the arousal is associated with can occur, and this increases the information available about the object of the emotion. Ledoux 1996. Emotions can play a role in determining the significance or force that a perception has for us. A situation that is the object of an emotional perception will have more salience than it would otherwise. Emotions in this way collapse the distinction between the information conveyed by a statement and the statement's force. Gunter 2004. Taken together, these perceptual effects caused by emotional responses steer both our understanding of situations and events that we encounter and the significance that such encounters have for us, and thus play a role in determining virtue-relevant responses and traits. Emotion, value, and virtue. In addition to affecting virtue-relevant perception, emotions play a role in preventing axiological entropy, the fading over time of the sense of the importance of values that underlie virtue traits. In the absence of this function of emotions, this sense of importance would be minimized or lost. One line of support for this concept is research on psychological conditioning, as the association of emotional responses with values and the variable significance of values is symmetrical with the tenets of both classical and operant conditioning, including reinforcement and the extinction of learned responses. Miltenberger, 2016. The association of values and emotional responses serves as a reinforcer of the significance of these values, and these include broad sorts of values that underlie virtue-relevant traits. Of course, value reinforcement, though critical, is not the only factor in virtuous action and associated traits. This also depends on the application of these values in individual circumstances, and the conflict of values in many cases requires practical wisdom in deciding which value will prevail in such cases. Thus, there are several ways in which emotions may be necessary for virtue. What I have described above are not incompatible with Brady's claims about emotion and virtue, but explore other ways in which the two may be related. To return to my observations at the beginning, emotion. The basics is far from basic. It illuminates and spurs reflection on a number of different ways in which emotions relate to our lives. Article 4. Bringing Emotions to Reason by Paniel Reyes Cardenas. Not too many times have I been entrusted with comments on a seminal piece of work such as Michael Brady's 2019 book on the basics of emotion, but other occasions I've gotten to analyze and offer constructive criticism have represented a workload that demanded energy to leave other projects. Reading Brady's Boo as opposed to a chore has been a different and enjoyable experience. Analyzing and reading it has been delightful, hugely engaging, and also illuminating. This does not mean that I do not have critical remarks to pinpoint on it, but they should be read as a way of taking very seriously what Brady shows us in the book and engaging with its purpose. In a general sense, I have to acknowledge that a book on emotion touches the right intellectual fibers. The serious consideration of the issues at hand render it possible to emotionally engage with the topic. As my own work is oriented to epistemology and the history of philosophy, the comments I offer here come from a reader that is predisposed in a positive way to the topic, though with a particularly demanding attitude that gives a considerable weight to philosophical traditions. The above background entails that the criticisms and comments I offer here are thus envisioned as suggestions to improve an already excellent book. I also bear in mind that the book is a basic introduction to the topic, so the suggestions are adapted for a book of that format and what such format permits. These comments, in consequence, will be twofold. The first section will reconstruct the narrative of the book in the way I understood it, while the second section will offer some remarks and criticisms prompted by the book. I will conclude by making a general appraisal of what the book means and can mean to the recent philosophical literature on the subject. The structure of the book. Our author starts the book by explaining the overall plan. He will show us that the study of emotion is more and more prominent for a right understanding of ourselves, both from philosophical/intellectual and practical stances. He presents us with three types of theories of emotion: the feeling theory, the cognitive theory, and the perceptual theory, that allow us to delve in the matter by showing that, though contrasting views, they actually complete each other for a more flexible view of the prismatic complexity of emotions. Then the second chapter moves into explaining how emotions play a fundamental role in conforming intellectual virtues, such as curiosity and attentive understanding, to the richness of our rational lives. I was glad to see how Brady made crucial points on this. This allows us to consider emotions as integral in the achievement of rational and reflective control. The move is much needed. Emotions have been ostracized from epistemology for far too long. As a consequence of that exclusion, there is a limited approach to knowledge, one focused on tokens of knowledge as opposed to a wholesale consciousness of how we know, of self-controlled inquiry. This enriched view has made virtue epistemology a key player that values emotion in the philosophical discussion. However, the role of emotions is still to be acknowledged in further epistemological issues, such as the value of emotions involved in shaping the methodology of empirical sciences, a forgotten emotional aspect of our cognitive life. The third chapter touches on the relationship between emotions and actions. All the components of action, motivations, dispositions, desires, decisions, have an emotional dimension, and hence a positive view of their role is a key contribution for a theory of rational action. The question is not so much how we let emotion guide our actions, but how we are effectively integrating emotions in action. The more we do it, the more we have reflective control of our lives. The next chapter shows us how emotions can also be social and how groups can be subjects of emotion. Brady claims that positive social emotions balance our social lives in an appropriate manner, in such a way that helps us overcome a purely self-interested individualism that can appear with the pretense of being rational. A final chapter touches on the place of emotions in morality and aesthetics. Emotions appear as essential for a flourishing moral life, as well as for a development of the capacities for the appreciation of artistic expression. Without emotion, we are left with a fragmented view of the place of humanities and arts. We therefore need to account for emotions should we want an integrated view of these in the personal and social equilibrium. In addition, Brady offers us a very useful glossary at the end of the book, perhaps not so much as a way of covering the vocabulary in the manner of a dictionary, but as a way of recapitulating the core contributions of some of the concepts formulated and reformulated throughout the book. Reviews of the book that offer a comprehensive précis will surely be forthcoming, but I decided to reconstruct Brady's view as I read it, so that my critical and evaluative comments are apparent from my particular reading, for the perspective of an epistemological hindsight. On the reason/emotion dichotomy. It seems to me that the book represents a key achievement in the effort to overcome the unjustified dichotomy between reason and emotion as opposed states of a conscious being. Indeed, I think Brady's book explicitly helps to make a turning point in the appreciation of emotions that has been mentioned before, but perhaps not as widely and clearly as an introduction to the topic allows. Brady helps us to understand that the dichotomy between reason and emotion is not only false, but damaging, and step by step shows the different levels in which reasons and emotions are compatible and jointly necessary for human flourishing. The levels I can clearly see are the following. First, a psychological level in which the emotions are irreducible to irrational reports of behavior, and that their need for a healthy psychological life. Second, I see an important case made for the fact that they are needed in our epistemic lives. Some emotions are essential for achieving intellectual virtues and allow knowledge to flourish. Thirdly, and perhaps very importantly, I was pleasantly struck by the fact that the book touches on the importance of emotions in our moral and social lives. I can also say that the book helped me to understand the relevant place that emotion plays in the accountability that should be a hallmark of democracies. Thus, for example, one can wonder how social justice is triggered by social emotions. These emotions impede a cause from falling into oblivion and rights the wrong. Particularly significant examples, in my opinion, were those of the Hillsborough disaster of 1989 in Sheffield, or the sequels of colonialism worldwide, just to name a few. In spite of the time past, emotions help to achieve a mass consciousness of these events and a sense of accountability. Without exaggerating, I believe that this achievement is a very important one for the self-consciousness that a philosophy for the 21st century needs, as opposed to the previous century. Indeed, we inherited a dualistic view of emotion and reason that is characteristic of modern philosophy, one that takes for granted a dichotomy of emotion and reason as opposed to each other. The dichotomy obscured the place of emotions as well as the value of reason. We reason effectively and we inform our emotions of thought because, like the book clearly states, emotions are intentional. Charles Sanders Peirce, 1879, criticizing Cartesian doubt in his famous paper, The Fixation of Belief, said, "Let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts." Peirce, 1879-29. This has been interpreted as a criticism against the possibility of entertaining doubts without the irritation offered by external reality. But most importantly, I believe it also as a prophetic criticism of the dichotomy between emotions and reasons. If our intellects doubt without the support of our positive emotions, we run the risk of creating a gap between them and damage the value of what the heart tells us. It looks as though Brady effectively reconstructs this damaged relationship by showing how necessary the interplay between thought and emotion turns out to be, bringing philosophical traditions to the conversation. As said above, part of the nature of these remarks has to do with the engagement with the philosophical tradition. Hence, what follows are observations as to how the book could perhaps be more grounded in a tradition that goes further than the contemporary literature on the topic. Of course, this is not a criticism on the value of the book, but a proposal for a more substantive connection with the philosophical tradition. Furthermore, I take my cue from the authors cited in the book, whom we benefit from for a closer look to the study of the evolving philosophical ideas on these topics, such as Martha Nussbaum, 2001, Christopher Hookway, 2000-2001, Linda Zagzebski, 2003, and so forth. On emotions and knowledge. With regards to knowledge and epistemology, the book has made very important contributions that clarify the debate. Brady's argument for the key role of emotions in the achievement of intellectual virtues seems to me impeccable. The same can be said when it shows how understanding also needs a positive view of emotions. However, little seems to be said about a final step of our epistemic character, which is the role of emotions in self-knowledge, and how emotions contribute to our integration to a community and human flourishing. I believe that the narrative allowed Brady to show us a bit more in the way of the important place of emotions in the knowledge of the convergence of emotions and thought in our intellectual lives, and the need of this to achieve a positive grasp of the meaning of our own selves. All in all, my criticism is that the book leaves out the crucial motivation of a philosophical approach to emotions. We want to understand emotions philosophically because we want to understand ourselves better. We need to integrate this knowledge to our more ample integration to our community relationships. And finally, we need to understand emotions in the context of a meaningful life. The understanding of emotions is philosophically salient to value the universe of our social interaction as human beings, because our social lives are emotional interactions. Psychological, sociological, and historical approaches to emotion are very important, but they cannot provide us with the answers of a philosophical approach to emotion. This key aspect of an introductory book to a philosophical understanding of emotions needs a more explicit engagement with the value of such philosophy and its unique contribution. On emotions and morality, on the importance of emotion for moral development and even for flourishing moral lives. I think that though Brady did a great job in explaining step by step how intertwined emotions and reasons are in our moral lives, it is nonetheless still lacking in considering one of the most important aspects of the interplay of these. I am particularly thinking about the important phenomenon of conscience and how moral conscience plays a key role in our moral lives. In the philosophical tradition, authors such as the medieval philosophers and theologians, particularly Aquinas, Natilla 2021, and Duns Scotus, Natilla 2021, and most clearly Hegel, 1976, consider that moral conscience cannot even be formed in the first place without the right interplay of emotions. This stance is one of the most striking positive contributions of emotions in the history of philosophy, and has been studied with particular emphasis attending to the interplay of the emotions of shame, pride, guilt, and empathy. The work of Jason J. Howard, 2014, seems to me highly valuable in explaining this interaction in the emotional forming of conscience, as well as the history of the philosophy of it. Brady's book has a fair emphasis on the uniqueness of different emotional states, but falls short in showing us how emotions are involved in constructing our moral lives. There are many important works in this direction that pass unnoticed, and the outstanding work which I think should be engaged is what Dan Zahavi, 2005, 2012, 2014, has done to explain a phenomenology of emotions and the formation of morality and self. On emotions and psychology, the book presents a very clear and concise view of William James' view of what constitutes his canonical version on emotion. But perhaps one can get a different view of emotion from other works such as The Will to Believe, 1897, and The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902. In these works, James does not seem to follow up on the reduction of emotions to the feeling of bodily changes. Other than being one of the founders of experimental psychology, James is known for being one of the great American pragmatists, and the view of emotion that emerges from his works is impinged by the tenets of the pragmatist tradition. Let me explain myself on this. It seems to me that the view of emotion presented in these other works by James might be worth considering because it offers a way to expand aspects of pragmatist approaches to epistemology. Reasons to believe in P, for example, involve our affections and emotions. These help to warrant our beliefs when we lack the evidence of facts, but are not obliged to suspend our belief. For James, it is crucial to accept that reasonable hopes are provided by our passionate and momentous states. This holds an important value for action. It seems as though while James squares a definition of emotion as feelings of bodily changes, he is probably presenting one side of the story. For when he uses the terms passions and affections, he also seems to mean another aspect of emotions that he did not reduce to the feelings of bodily changes. This observation about emotion and passion in James' philosophy is sadly absent in Brady's assessment of James. Ethics and emotions. When reading the book, one can notice in the section devoted to the importance of emotion and morality that there is a clear explanation of the different dimensions of ethics: normative, applied, and metaethics. Brady then moves on to explain the different ways in which morality is helped or indeed formed by emotion. Brady does well in explaining these facts. However, it does not entail adopting an emotivist/sentimentalist stance on ethics. Unfortunately, I think that not mentioning that the emotivist/sentimentalist stance belongs to metaethics does not help the cause of the book, since the reader might be, as I honestly was, confused and could take him to be talking about different approaches to normative ethics. In such a case, the reader can make an assessment of the importance of emotions in adopting any kind of normative or applied ethics, as Brady states. However, for the case of emotions considered as the ground for metaethics, as Hume, 2007, 1739, 1998, 1777, the most outstanding emotivist, might have it, the reader might risk ending up concluding that Brady is unwittingly positing a dualism between emotion and reason, in which one cannot affect the other. And this is somehow a way to return tentatively to one of the central questions of the book. Do emotions cloud our judgment? In this sense, I consider it very important for Brady to state more clearly that an emotivist/sentimentalist approach on metaethics renders a mistaken view of emotion. Even though an emotivist grounds ethics on emotion, something that seems positive, the ultimate image is one in which emotion is incompatible with reason, being, as it is, a non-cognitivist approach in a Humean fashion. The outcome of such implicit emotivism might be problematic. I believe that a key achievement of the book, as said above, is the casting of doubts on the reason/emotion dichotomy, and a successful argument that emotions are a core tenet of a cogent view of rationality. That is why I consider it to be important to avoid an unintentional regress to a dualistic view. What this book brings. In conclusion, Brady offers us a long overdue introduction to the topic of emotion from a philosophical perspective. This much-needed contribution comes in time to stir up the philosophical community that works on epistemology, ethics, and even metaphysics. Something of a gentle call to listen to our emotions. Article 5, Beyond the Basics of Emotions, by Paul Bloomfield. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to comment on Michael Brady's Emotion. The Basics, 2019, which is an excellent introduction to the philosophy of the emotions. It is accessible, clear, well-organized, penetrating, and just polemical enough to have an engaging theoretical edge. Any student using this book as a text, or any lay reader picking the book up just out of curiosity, will learn much more from it than its slim size would indicate. These comments, however, go beyond the book's function as an introductory text and will instead be a vehicle to go deeper. There's plenty of material to choose from as the theory grounding the book is interesting and often provocative. There are a number of extremely fascinating theses discussed and explored. Brady's pluralistic view of emotions is novel and quite promising from a theoretical point of view. The nuanced discussion of emotion as motivating inquiry was very interesting, and his view that emotions help us bypass unhelpful cognition is also novel. We'll return to it below, as was the idea of group emotions, etc. There's a surplus of good philosophy included, so the challenge for a commentator is in selecting topics for discussion. Aside from, and not to detract from this praise, I do have some substantial criticism. Indeed, if I compare my own thoughts on emotion, I come at them with a different sensibility than Brady does. And this is because I'm fairly skeptical of emotional reactions. I see them as often specious, so what will be a friendly disagreement between Brady and I naturally ensues. I take a less sanguine view of emotions than he does, and probably less so than most other philosophers of emotion. In general, while I see that emotions can play all or at least many of the positive, contributory roles that Brady lays out so well and clearly, that emotions can help us gain knowledge and act well, that they can inform our moral lives and social behavior. In fact, I think having reliable emotional reactions, suitable for providing epistemic and moral justification, is more rare than it is typically assumed, for reasons that will hopefully come out below. We are living in turbulent and emotional times. A lot of this has been brought about by politics and a global pandemic. In the USA, we are bombarded by Trump and his tweets. In the UK, we are bombarded by Boris Johnson and his Brexit. Underneath this, causing much of it, is fear, anger, anxiety, loss, desperation, and in many cases, despondency, so overwhelming that, at least in the USA, suicide rates are tragically up and life expectancy in general is down. Conservatives feel like inevitable demographic changes will end their way of life, and liberals feel like society is regressing back into a more unjust society from which it has struggled to emerge. Pessimism is everywhere, and it seems as if people are regularly and unhelpfully overwhelmed by their own emotions. These days, many appear to have become even more emotional than in the past. So, as I say, I am not fully sanguine about the emotions, probably less so than most. For example, there is little in Brady's book about negative emotions or all the ways in which emotions are counterproductive. Consider a list of ugly emotions which all humans would always be better off without. Apathy, hopelessness, despair, dread, loneliness, bitterness, spite, greed, jealousy, covetousness, vindictiveness, vengefulness, arrogance, condescension, hubris, wrath, malice, and the granddaddy of all negative emotions. Hey, natural selection has outfitted us to feel all these things, but we would all be better off in all respects without them in our lives. Sure, love, joy, and compassion are wonderful. Bring on bounteous love, joy, and compassion, the more the merrier. But the emotions are, taken together, far from sweetness and sunshine. So, though I fear this borders on the edge of misanthropy, it seems to me as if, overall, the theory of emotions in Brady's book is a bit too positive or rosy. It seems obvious to me that overly emotional decision-making is most often poor decision-making. So I think most people would probably live better lives and make better decisions if they were somewhat more cognitive and less emotional than they actually are. I did not come to bury emotions, but I won't praise them too highly either. It is quite likely that we would all gain if there were more tranquility in the world, more equanimity. Of course, passion has its place, which is especially the bedroom. But when passion wanders from this home, it often only makes trouble. These general thoughts about emotions do not take us very far philosophically into Brady's book, however, and that is the goal. So, I'll begin by addressing some concerns with what is said about emotion and action, and move on to how emotions are related to knowledge, and close with a short discussion about emotions and virtue. Given constraints of space, my comments will be necessarily brief, but perhaps they will serve to move the dialectic along. The practical value of emotions. Brady's view is that emotions help us with action because they forestall forms of cognition which may lead one astray. He writes, "Feelings move us to do the things that we ought to do by overcoming our tendency towards short-term and damaging reflection and decision-making." 89. His discussion of remorse is indicative. Much like learning not to repeat painful actions, when we feel remorse over something we've done, we are far less likely to consider doing it again. In this sense, emotions are heuristics which help us to instinctively do the right thing. And indeed, this may be a good place to begin thinking about emotions as naturally selected reactions to events common in nature. Nevertheless, emotions for most people tend to be coarse-grained and they overspread. Consider, for example, disgust, a basic emotion which helps us avoid contamination and contagion. This efficiently allows us to avoid rotten food and generally unhealthy substances. It is no mystery why the smell of excrement is disgusting to humans but not to pigs. No disrespect to pigs intended. The problem is that humans have also ended up being disgusted by what is merely unfamiliar and not only what is unhealthy. For example, some find foods of other cultures disgusting. Or, more perniciously, homophobes are often disgusted by homosexuality. So, disgust proves unreliable, and the problem generalizes. Emotions are often like a club when, in many complicated human circumstances, something more like a scalpel is needed. A more pointed criticism is that there is something in Brady's idea that part of the natural or proper function of emotions is to help us avoid reflection and cognition, which strikes me as historically backward. It seems safe to assume that cognition and reflection are phylogenetically more recent than emotions. Many animals seem to express anger, and many land and marine mammals seem to grieve death in similar ways. While our emotions are undoubtedly more subtle and nuanced than those of other species, what makes Homo sapiens exceptional on Earth is our cognition, not our emotion. Perhaps it is even reasonable to think that humans began to be reflective, thinking creatures because relying on emotional heuristics proved unreliable. Even if not, it seems unlikely to me that it is part of the proper function of emotions that they prevent unhelpful cognition, since cognition came after the emotions emerged. Emotions may in fact inhibit cognition, but this is not why we have them. If some berries make us nauseous, we're not tempted by them again. If some action causes us remorse, we are not tempted to repeat it. True, the purpose of remorse is to prevent repeating mistakes. Forestalling cognition may be a means to this end, but I would argue that forestalling cognition is not what remorse or nausea is for, so to speak. Emotions and knowledge. Normative assessment of emotions. And this leads us to the relation of emotions to knowledge. Were I to name a single substantive criticism of the tenor of the book, it would be that it contains only very little about the ways in which emotions are open to normative assessment. Superficially, emotions can be irrational, or rational yet unjustified, or justified yet inapt, or, if all goes right, emotions can be fitting. Quick examples of these categories. It is irrational to feel proud of the blue sky, to use Philippa Foot's 1978 example. It is unjustified, but not necessarily irrational to feel jealousy when an attractive stranger smiles at one's partner. Emotions can be justified even when they are inappropriate or even self-defeating. To take a story from Seneca's On Anger, I may be justified in my rage at a tyrant who has killed one of my children in front of my eyes, but if raging will lead the tyrant to kill me, leaving my other children without a parent, then my rage is inapt, despite its justification. Cooper and Procope, 1995. What we want are emotions which are fitting, as Brady does mention late in the book in the section on virtue. The cardinal and self-regulating virtue of temperance yields fitting emotions, passions, desires, and appetites, but a full-throated discussion of temperance would take us far afield. The important point here is that only virtuous people have reliably fitting emotions, and emotions will be less fitting the further one is from being virtuous. The obvious problem is that most people are merely average or mediocre when it comes to being virtuous, and so their emotions will be less than fitting to that same degree. So, a central criticism of the book is that it lacks this normative angle. As a result, my perspective on Brady's position is nuanced. On the one hand, he is certainly right that emotions can lead us to knowledge and appropriate action in the ways he says. On the other hand, it seems likely that this is far less frequent and far more difficult to pull off than he suggests. Of course, how frequently people's emotions are helpful versus how frequently they are deleterious is an empirical question, one it would be very interesting to answer. The point, however, is that we cannot just infer that because emotions can be helpful or deleterious that they often are. There's a reason the ancient Greeks called the emotions pathos, referring to both emotion and suffering, and it is the root of our word pathology. Emotions and passions, strong and uncontrolled as they are, seem to distort. Hume's 1777-1975 word stain perception and judgment and are far from reliable in bringing about a deep, veridic, and insightful understanding of the world. They become inarticulate and shade into the ineffable. The Stoics thought that thinking is like walking where we can stop and start at will, while emotions are like running and our momentum makes them impossible to stop at will. When people are angry, we often say things we later regret. They say love is blind, and it surely often is. Pride can be fine, but more often it goeth before the fall, etc. As mentioned above, even justified emotions may not be fitting. Even if most of us have an average amount of emotional intelligence, emotionally wise people are as rare as wise people are generally. Curiosity as an emotion. There are two central issues in the chapter on emotion and knowledge to address. The first concerns curiosity. When it comes to the motivation for knowledge, Brady puts a lot of weight on curiosity and perhaps too much. The first reason for this is because curiosity seems rare, at least insofar as it goes deeper than merely being interested in a topic, and it often implies some mystery to be solved. Curiosity implies some genuine puzzlement, some intrigue, and frisson. Perhaps a more pressing worry than frequency is whether or not curiosity really is an emotion at all. Other philosophers, including Lewis Ross, 2018, and Lonnie Watson, 2018, think curiosity is a virtue. My own gut feelings about curiosity is that it is really nothing more than an intellectual desire. It is similar to lust, which is a carnal desire, and neither curiosity nor lust strike me as emotions. Now, perhaps, of course, Brady is right and curiosity is an emotion, but this seems at this point a wide-open theoretical question. This is not to say, of course, that Brady should have engaged this philosophical dispute in an introductory text. It was perfectly fine for him to present curiosity as an emotion in the book, and as a main motivation for intellectual inquiry. But from a more advanced philosophical point of view, the point is tendentious. Emotions and knowledge about value. The other point to make about the chapter on emotion and knowledge concerns Brady's claims about how we can gain knowledge about value from emotions. There is a good, important, and valuable point to be made here, but perhaps Brady overstated it a bit and has made the emotions seem more valuable for the epistemology of value than is actually the case. Michael Stocker's Valuing Emotions, 1996, also takes up the question of how we learn about what we value through our emotional reactions. Two of his examples are as follows. The first is that we are to imagine hearing someone from another department be unfairly critical of a new junior colleague of ours, and we surprise ourselves by stridently coming to our colleague's defense, revealing to us that we think more highly or care more about our new colleague than we might have thought. In the second example, imagine we typically don't think much about having school spirit. Then, while traveling, we find ourselves elated by news of a big victory for our school sports team, for which we learn that we do care more about our school than we had realized. This is all well and good. Emotions can be revelatory to us about what we value in the world. The concern, however, is the inference from learning about what we value to learning about what is valuable, full stop. Brady writes, we can't get information about what is charming or erotic or repellent without having the relevant emotions or feelings. We can't get information that someone is charming without being charmed by them. 55. Well, this may well be true, but there is a difference between how our emotions can allow us to detect what is truly or objectively of value in the world and how emotions, as Hume would put it, stain and gild the world with our effect. Pictures of starving children pull sharply on our heartstrings, and we feel pity and simply know, as certainly as we know that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, that there is something tragically unjust and wrong with the depicted state of affairs. But a person who is charming to me might be annoying to you, and it is unlikely that there is any objectivity involved regarding judgments about who is charming and who is not. Too much personal preference is involved here. Charm is in the eye of the beholder. Recall the earlier discussion of disgust. While it can reliably help us detect what is unhealthy for us, it is overall unreliable insofar as we can find things disgusting which simply are very much not to our liking. It is good to be charmed by a baby, much less so to be charmed by a conman or a conniver. So, again, the point is nuanced. When basic emotions serve as heuristics so that we fear driving through a blizzard, or we're suspicious of a stranger, or disgusted by a smell, we would be foolish to disregard such emotions. Emotions can reveal what is objectively of value in the world. But again, experience and observation seem to indicate that this is far rarer than Brady suggests. Emotions do reliably reveal to us what we value and disvalue. But whether or not our values reveal what is objectively valuable in the world depends upon what we happen to value, and this is another matter entirely. Emotions and virtue. A final topic for brief discussion concerns emotion and virtue. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume some form of eudaimonism. Given eudaimonia, each virtuous action is supposed to aim at what is tekeion, or what is fine or noble, and not some other end. Phronesis, or practical wisdom, is supposed to guide our determination of what is valuable in general, our axiology, and what is fine or noble in moral situations. It is then up to the individual virtues to determine what to do in particular cases. So, in thinking about the role of the emotions in virtuous action, there is a question as to how much virtuous people are actually guided by their emotions. Now, recall, virtuous people have reliably fitting emotional responses to situations, so we do not have to worry about them feeling the wrong thing. They'll feel the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, etc. Good. But virtues are not emotions, and emotions are not virtues. And it seems that virtuous action should be guided by virtue and not by emotion. Virtuous people have inculcated the virtues to the degree that in sudden or emergency situations they respond virtuously. Let's assume we are all ideally virtuous. So, the enemy launches a surprise attack upon our camp in the middle of the night. Do our fears guide our actions in these dangerous circumstances? No, Our guide is our courage. We are confronted with injustice in the street, and we have to react by being fair and just. Do we use anger or righteous indignation to guide us? No, it is justice which determines the fair response. We are invited to a spontaneous party on a Tuesday night with all our friends when we have an important meeting or exam Wednesday morning. Do we use our love for our friends and joie de vivre to guide us in these tempting circumstances? No, it is temperance which guides us, etc. The point is that virtuous people have trained themselves to be virtuous, and they will be guided by emotions only when they have no better decision procedure to use. When we feel suspicious of a stranger and have no other information, then of course we should heed our gut feelings. But in complex situations requiring immediate action, when anything remotely like genuine wisdom is required, emotions become less reliable, and virtuous people will fall back on habituation and training and not their emotion. Military boot camp is all about training soldiers to follow orders despite whatever they may feel. The point is not that the military's methods are adequate to all purposes, but that we must use our higher cognitive faculties to train our phylogenetically less advanced and more unruly emotions. In situations in which we have time to deliberate, emotions still do not generally play a decisive role in determining what to do. Of course, virtuous people will consider their emotions in any prolonged deliberation. Their emotions will play the same role in their decision procedure as any other evidence or relevant consideration may. But this does not imply that emotions are in any way dispositive or probative within deliberations, nor a fortiori that we should deliberate while in the grip of emotions. The idea of reflecting in a calm and cool state is an old idea, indeed. Perhaps this will be overstating my own case here, but in many, though not all cases, emotions are to virtue what Aristotle, 340 BC 2004, says pleasure is to virtue. Taking pleasure in a virtuous action completes the action, but does not motivate it. True, there are times when it is only right to be moved by love or compassion, but such conclusions do not generalize well. So, it is possible that for virtuous people, their emotions will often follow their virtue and not the other way around. In this view, in these situations, virtuous emotions complete virtuous thought, but do not guide it. I am choosing between going to school A and B. A is where my family went, and I have a heartfelt, sentimental attachment to it, but B is better in my intended field of study. If I am virtuous and choose B, then my emotions will subsequently follow my choice. Final remarks. Of course, this is all horribly brief. Brady's plausible pluralism about theories of emotion has not been addressed, etc., etc. But as space is limited, I will simply close with a final congratulations to Michael Brady for writing such an excellent introduction to the philosophy of emotion.
This marks the end of the 2021 Volume 3, Issue 1 Summer Podcast Edition, Part 1 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion. Please go to 2021 Volume 3, Issue 1 Summer Podcast Edition, Part 2 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion to continue listening to this issue.